like to start every single morning with something that I fondly refer to as the jargon of the day, the jargon du jour, right? We know that autism is a jargon-intensive journey, and it can sink your battleship if you do not understand the terms, right? There's nothing worse than getting an opportunity to meet with somebody who is supposedly going to have some help and answers about your child, and they start using terms, and you go, I have no idea what you just said. It might as well have been in another language that I've never heard in my life before. And then worse, they say, oh, I'm so sorry, let me explain to you what I just said. And then they use a bunch more jargon terms. And then not only do you feel like, wow, I'm really missing the boat, and I must not, be smart enough to figure this out. I don't know if you all feel that way, but sometimes I go, really? I think I'm an intelligent person, but you just said things I have never heard of before. It's just jargon, and jargon is specific to different areas. There's waitress jargon and there's construction jargon, right? We have to get used to and make friends with the autism jargon and the psychology jargon and the education jargon and the ABA jargon, right? It's a lot. So what do we do when our child has to get caught up on a lot of different things? We don't try to heap it all on them at one fell swoop and say, here, figure this out. We try to give it to them one little bit at a time and link it all together to hopefully move towards having it make sense. So that's what we do with the jargon. Give you one term or one word or one anagram, explain it to you in the parlance of jargon, and then give you a slightly watered down version that maybe is a little more user-friendly, not as specific, but will help you to get a grasp on what it means. Okay, so here we are today, and our term for today is DTT. This is something that we talk about a lot. DTT stands for Discrete Trial Teaching. Discrete trial teaching, here's your definition. Discrete trial teaching is a teaching or intervention technique based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. DTT involves breaking down individual skills into small, discrete teaching units known as discrete trials. One of my biggest pet peeves in life is when you ask somebody what something means and they define it with all of the terms that were in the actual word that you were asking for the definition to begin with. So this is the perfect example of definitions that I just despise. Let's see if our slightly watered down version is any better. There are typically 3 parts to discrete trial. And there's this, I'm just being reminded that there are multiple slides here. Oh, this is the one still from before. Ah, okay. So this is the part of the so we haven't gone on to the working definition yet. Okay, so thank you for that, Emily. Emily, our technical director, who's so fabulous and keeps me on my toes. Okay, so this is still part of the other definition. There are typically 3 parts to the discrete trial: the discriminative stimulus, the SD, I know, more jargon. This is what I'm talking about: the student's response, which is the R, and the consequent, which is the C. A particular discrete trial may be practiced numerous times until the target skill is mastered. Okay, so now moving on to the working definition. Let's see if we can make this a little bit user-friendly, and then I'm going to give you some examples. A particular behavioral teaching technique that involves breaking a skill down into small teaching units. Each teaching unit has a distinct beginning, which is called the antecedent, and an end, which is the consequence given depending on the child's response. Each unit is repeatedly presented to the child until the target skill is mastered. Okay, that's a little bit better, right? But what we want to talk about is, again, this beginning, middle, and end. And what we're doing is setting up sort of like a test tube, a controlled environment where we know we want to begin to teach something, and we're going to do it in this very contrived way. Again, this is DTT. Little asterisk here that I talk about all the time. DTT is one element of ABA. It is not all of ABA. I think my biggest pet peeve around, oh, I can't even say that. My biggest pet peeve around ABA, not around autism, because I have a bunch of pet peeves around how autism is perceived, but one of my biggest pet peeves around ABA is people who use the term DTT and ABA indiscriminately as if they both mean exactly the same thing. They don't. DTT is one element of ABA. And the example I always like to use is your car. Your steering wheel is a very important part of your car. You wouldn't want to drive without it. It's so essential to the car, but it is not the same thing as the car. And you would never use those two terms interchangeably, your steering wheel and your car. Same thing with DTT. DTT is the steering wheel. It's a very important part of ABA, but it is not the whole thing and should not be used interchangeably with the term ABA. One element of it, an important one, but not the whole thing. If you wanted to go on a trip across the country, you would not say, I'm taking my steering wheel. You would not get very far. You would not be very successful. Same thing with DTT. It's an important part of it. It's going to help us to steer the car, but we're not going to get where we want to get with DTT alone. ABA encompasses a lot of different things that we'll talk about, but today we're just talking about DTT, one element of ABA. It is the element that we're going to use a lot of the time to introduce a new skill because it breaks it down into these little chunks and says we're going to teach this one skill right here, and we're going to set up a very specific environment in which there is going to be a distinct beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is going to be the thing that we say or do to signal to the child this is a teaching moment. And then they're going to have their response, and then there's going to be a very specific controlled consequence, which if they get the response right is going to be reinforcement. So we will see time and time again when you, and DTT can be done in a lot of different ways. When we watch the A Word, we see Jack Riley is not using a table, he's just sitting in a chair. And that's very common with DTT, so that we can minimize distractions. We put a child in a chair, and we're going to teach them one specific thing. If we're teaching compliance, it may be that we say to the child, touch your nose. That's the SD, the thing that we do or say to get the desired response. The desired response is that the child touches their nose. And we have the consequence that we go, good job, and tickle them, reinforcement, right? That's only if saying good job and tickling is reinforcing to this individual child, right? But a very specific thing. And we do it in a set of trials so that the child has a bunch of opportunities to get it. I always like to say, you know, that 10 is a good number, but a lot of times we're not going to do 10 trials. And we don't want to do more than 10 trials before we take a break, right? But we're saying to the child, touch your nose, and the child touches their nose, good job, right? And then a second goes by and we go, touch your nose, child touches their nose, good job. Now eventually we're going to vary it. Once they have touched their nose, we're going to, you know, say touch your nose, touch your head, touch your ears, right? But in the beginning, we're not. We're only going to work on touch your nose until they get that. And once they have that, then we'll work on touch your head. And when they have touch your head, then eventually we might alternate touch your nose, touch your head. Okay? But it's a very specific, contrived thing. When you see videotape of somebody working with a child, the child sitting there, and they're asking them to do something, give me this, touch this, which one of these has wings? And the child, it's a very short thing, a trial only takes a brief period of time, and the child does the response, and there's immediate reinforcement. And what that does is it teaches the child that it's worthwhile to learn. This is my mother's interpretation of this because I watched my child do this for years. It teaches them that it's worthwhile to learn because they get reinforced by it. And we know that principle 1 of ABA is that in order for any behavior to be maintained, it has to be reinforcing. So it's not about torturing the child at all. It's about giving the child multiple opportunities to be rewarded. And then once a child starts to gain a skill in DTT, then we're going to use some other methods to help the child to generalize, and we're going to do that even within DTT, but we're going to give the child the skills to be able to do this particular targeted skill in the real world. So after we've worked on this with DTT, we need to work on it in a natural environment training way. And we're going to work on it for fluency, because that's what's going to make this skill their very own. Okay, so DTT, a very important element of ABA, not the whole thing. We wouldn't want to stop there, right? We wouldn't want to just teach somebody something by rote at a table and call it done, because it's not done, right? But it's a really important element and really great for beginning to teach a skill. You know, if your child needs to be caught up with some very basic things, it really separates it into these very distinct, very small increments that are doable. Oh, it's so much easier to teach in that way, and our kids do learn in that way. And not only that, they get excited to learn. They go, oh, I can do this, and I get rewarded for it, which means that they're willing to work through some of the more difficult things for them. Our kids have difficult things to work through. It is harder for them in a lot of respects to make eye contact, to speak, to pay attention, to tune out the things that are happening around them. But if we make it really small and reinforce them for it, they discover it's not only worthwhile, but it's empowering, and then they want to learn. I watched my own child do this. We're watching Jack Riley on the A Word do this, and I've seen other kids, they become sponges. They're like, teach me some more. Our kids, this is what works in the beginning with a skill. So DTT, if you still don't get it, that's okay. You're starting to get an understanding of it, and we're going to talk about this more every day. So at least now you understand DTT, ABA. ABA is sort of the bigger thing. DTT is a really important part of it, not the whole thing.